Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's webinar in the Ethics of Digital Literacy series hosted by Drew Teach. Tonight, we are focusing on building ethical communities, and our presenter is Ian O'Byrne. Ian, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me in. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with all of you. I am a assistant professor of literacy education at the College of Charleston in the Southeast, and I'm playing the same game that many of you are, sitting in our classrooms trying to wonder what sort of delays and movement and interaction that we have as we prepare for this upcoming virus. So it's good to think about something else for a change and think about ethics in digital spaces. So I'm really looking forward to our chat tonight.
Dr. Turner, we can't hear you.
That's because I unmuted Ian rather than myself. Sorry. So we still have a couple people coming in, I think, but Ian, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sounds good. Is my slide deck displaying now, Kristen?
It is.
Sounds great. So once again, I appreciate the opportunity to come chat with all of you. I'm going to share materials from the edited collection that Kristen just put forth, thinking about digital literacy, but also the ethics involved in this. I wrote a meditation. A meditation was an organizational section, a problematization of ethics and digital literacy to think about what are some of the contexts that we need to think about. So I have a slide deck that I just tweeted out, and I'm sure that we can pick that up and share it out through our Twitter feeds. I also have a blog post that shares some other links along with this. I view this as the start of a discussion. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Hopefully we have more dialogue than just me yammering on. As I tell my students frequently, more of you talking, less of me is a good thing. And we should use the affordances or the ability so that we can have a little bit of a chat and dialogue, because I asked some pretty pointed questions and I want to know what your thoughts are. So once again, the slide deck is out online. There is a blog post along with this. And at any point, please ping us or virtually raise your hand or ferret off a question in Zoom, and we will try and jump on top of this to make sense of it. So I'm online, I'm pretty social, so you can get in touch with me at any point. My Twitter handle is there, but I'll share more resources. To get us started, I want to spend a little bit of time to think about ethics as we have our students get involved and engage in literacy practices online. I also want to think about the ethics that are involved as we try to get involved and interact with others online. What are the challenges that we have as digital citizens as we try to connect with others? How do we make these judgments about the ethics in these digital spaces? Who makes these judgments? And then what should we as educators do about this? Is it our job to reify these decisions that these ethical decisions? Is it our job as educators and possibly parents to help spread and promote some of these decisions about the ethics, what's appropriate and not appropriate online? So that's pretty much what I want to take our time to think about tonight, and more importantly, problematize in our time together. Once again, I'm in a lot of spaces and a lot of places online. I am on Twitter, I blog, I have a weekly newsletter where I think about education, literacy, technology. I also am a member of the Screen Time Research Group, and I co-host a podcast with this very intelligent, talented individual where we think about living and learning in an age of screen time. So if you are interested in that, we try to take all of this contextual info and think and talk about it in a no-nonsense way that makes it a little bit more palatable for most normal people out there. So what we're going to talk about today, first of all, we're going to talk about what it means to live in reality. What does reality mean? What does public mean? And try to push back against that a little bit. Think about what it means to be a digital citizen. What are our thoughts about being a digital citizen? And then we're going to try and thread that needle and say, okay, how do we think about ethics and digital citizenship and what these two things mean together? So starting off, what does this reality in public mean? In the literature, you'll see this idea about digital dualism pop up. The idea with digital dualism is that there are two distinct spheres, that there is this difference between online and offline spaces. Many of us, we say that, or our colleagues say that we don't want to be online. We don't want to have a digital identity. We try to separate our online from our offline persona. I have colleagues that try to keep their work email separate from the personal email. And we try to carve out these different spaces to separate off these different components. The challenge is that dichotomy really does not exist. We have seen ever since the Snowden revelations and the Snowden leaks that we always have data being collected about us, that there really is no separation between online and offline. We might frame it that way. We might think about there is a separation between online and offline, but for all intents and purposes, there is none. We are always on camera. We are always on a stage. And there is no separation between those two elements. As much as we would like there to be, there really is not. This also has huge questions about what is public and what is private. We see a lot of research and literature right now about surveillance systems and surveillance states. There's a lot of literature now and research about like Ring doorbells and whether or not they're watching us all the time. Many of us get a bit paranoid about, we'll ask a question and then the next day or later that night, we will see a Google ad pop up about the question that we voiced, but we didn't Google it. And then we're trying to figure out, are these devices listening to us all the time? So we're always trying to figure out what is public and what is private. And we're trying to make sense of, do we really have any privacy anymore? When we go out in public spaces, should we expect that all of our information and our identity and our data should be made available to others? So we have very real questions, and I don't think that we spend enough time asking those questions and expressing how we really feel about that. There's also very real questions about the digital divide and issues of access. So case in point, right now, many of us are in institutions of higher ed, or we work for K-12. We're thinking about moving our learning environments to digital spaces or moving them online. But with that, there is this privileging of some students and this expectation that all students will just be able to get online because that's where they are at all times, when we know that's not really the case. So we have to have questions about, as we move to these digital spaces, as we think about that digital dualism, the fact that there are some components of our population that don't have access to it, but then also we have to ask questions about, how ethically do we treat all members of that digital space? You know, we see evidence of bullying, misogyny, racism, as we push back against members of our society online. And we have to ask questions about whether or not that is ethical treatment. And that's what we want as we engage online, but then also we have our students engage online. We also have very real concerns about privacy and security. We now live in an age where hacks will happen. Passwords will be broken. Entities will collect our data and lose that data. We famously know about the Equifax hacks. We famously know about the Yahoo hacks. And we have to pretty much expect that, for the most part, most, if not all, of the organizations that handle our data will lose access or will be breached at some point. We should also ask questions about our digital, about our learning institutions. In K-12 and higher ed, when we sign in, we use Google Apps. When we sign in, use our institutional credentials. How private and secure is that information that the institution has on us? And then what happens if and when they get hacked, or what happens if and when we leave and we go to a different institution. So we have to always think about that data trail that we have and that we're leaving behind, and ethically, what is the responsibility of that data, and then how much ownership do we have of that data. There's also a specific balance between good and evil. With great power comes great responsibility. I think it was Spider-Man. Kristen, was it Spider-Man's uncle that said that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks for the fact check. So we have to think about the balance between good and evil. And we can do incredible things through the use of digital tools. We can sit here together and spend a little bit of time chatting. We can go on Twitter and canvas a crowd. We can watch cat videos online for about 6 hours. But then also there's a lot of harm that can come. And we have very real questions about depression. We have very real questions about issues of screen time. We have very real questions about our data and privacy. So we have to think about the good and the bad that can come from this, and how we want to interact in digital spaces. Lastly, there's a real need for transparency. One of the things that we've noticed over the last 6 years, 7 years, I read a little bit too much about these digital spaces. One of the things that we recognize is there is a lack of transparency. And what I mean by that is the internet, for the most part, has become uninterpretable. That means we cannot make sense of what's happening online. We don't know what the algorithms are doing to feed content to us. We don't know what Facebook or Twitter, what LinkedIn is pushing to us. We don't know what our internet service providers are pushing to us, what content they're collecting from us and selling. And so there is a need for transparency with all of these questions to try and figure out, how do we really protect ourselves? But then also, I think it's not just us, but then how do we protect our students, the learners that engage with us? How do we point for a possible better way? So I wanted to stop for a minute because a lot of words came out of my mouth, and I wanted to ask all of you, what do you think it means to be ethical given all of those things that we just talked about?
Hi, I'm Julia. So for me, to be ethical in a digital context means being honest and informed about the information that you put out, or putting a disclaimer with your information that this is my opinion, certain things, that things don't get confused. I think it also means being on the receiving end, going out of your way to make sure things you're reading are correct and not just assuming everything is true or everything is honest. It's about being aware that you have so much information that it can get mixed up, kind of like you said. And so we, as ethical digital citizens trying to help the public of the digital community, need to go out of our way to untangle it when we can.
Thank you for that. That was much more eloquent than I would have stated. Julia, what do you do? Where are you?
I'm at Summit High School in New Jersey, and I'm teaching theater.
Very cool. Very cool. So you have a little bit of the consumption side, a little bit of the creation side, and sharing out. One of the challenges, I agree with everything that you said. One of the challenges that I often discuss with my students, I mainly deal with pre-service teachers, but then I do professional development with a lot of in-service teachers. And the question that we always struggle with is it okay to learn online and make mistakes online and show evidence that you're trying to learn? As you explore a new area, is it okay to think and write and blog about that and share what you're learning and possibly be wrong and change your mind as you're creating new content? And we're thinking about in the context of educators, but then also our students in middle grade, secondary. Is it okay for them to learn and be wrong and have a different opinion over time?
Hi, I'm Glenna. To bounce off of what Julia was saying, I think another way that we can be ethical is being true to who we really are as people. Like, I think that in person, obviously, there's a lot more, I guess, nervousness about commenting in an angry way or something like that. And people have that protection of the wall behind Facebook or Twitter, just the computer in general. And I think that we need ourselves and to teach our students to be very aware of that, because it's so easy to just, really angrily type something out in a way that you never, ever, ever would do in person, or that would be mitigated by your body language or your tone of voice or something. So I think we have to strive to really be authentic and aware of how our messages are being communicated.
Thank you for that. Where are you? What do you teach?
So I am in Frelinghuysen Middle School in Morristown, and I teach both French and ESL grades 6, 7, and 8.
Very cool. That's one of the pieces of research I've been looking at lately, is looking at advocacy and activism in digital spaces, and not just educators, but youth. And so when we see the climate kids and Greta, and they speak out online and they use digital tools and spaces to stand up for themselves and express their narrative and push back against possible harmful narratives, what's the role of the educator? What should we do in those spaces? Should we support and amplify the voices of our youth, or should we sort of like say, don't really be, don't express your true voice or your true narrative here?
Can I speak again, if that's okay, on that?
Go for it.
I think that when it comes to students expressing their truth online, I do think that's important and that they should be able to do that. I think the issue is kind of going off of what Glenna said. There's this element of separation that makes it easier to express yourself in a way that is unkind or unaware or caring of how others will react. And so I think as an educator, it's our job to say, okay, you should say what you want to say. Let's think about how you say it, or think about how it will be received, and do the same things we would do. I think it loses that element of social awareness, and of, if you see someone and you say something awful to them and they get upset, you have a physical reaction. But if you say something awful over the internet, you don't have to see their face. You know what I mean? And so, or if you say something that might be hurtful and you're not sure, like, it's about teaching students how to consider the way they phrase things and consider the reactions of others who may not be like-minded, because the internet is kind of everywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's also, it never leaves. Overseas, we're fighting for the right to be forgotten, and we're fighting for the opportunity to remove that. In California, we see some of that as well, thinking about our data trail and the opportunity to remove things from the internet, which I also have severe opinions about. But there's a thought process about, does that harmful discourse or that bullying or that trolling, does that still live out online? And part of the question that I'm also asking here about ethics is, how do we feel about that? Is that what we want? Most of us engage as adults on Facebook or Twitter or these social spaces, or we choose not to. In a lot of our classrooms, we prepare our students as if the goal was to enter those digital spaces and also discuss and converse and engage in literate practices. Is that what we really want? Is that the goal? And perhaps it's not.
I think the Greta Thunberg example is an excellent one, because she's doing a couple of things that I think are really good hallmarks of ethics in the digital world. She's speaking out, but she's speaking only based on tried and true evidence. So that's one pointer I think that is a great example, and she's young, she's a perfect role model in that way for students. But the other thing she's doing, I think, is I call it like she's punching up. She's not picking on anybody. She's going after like politicians who have consistently ignored and denied and what have you. So I think that those are both, she's not trolling anybody. She's just putting, this is what I think out there and what I think is based on evidence. And she'll like, here's the link, here's the source, here's this, here's that. And so I think that's a really good example. I know I talked about her with my students last week. A couple of them didn't know who she was, and they were really like blown away by how, powerful in a sense she's become. through the
Yeah.
digital world.
It's also pretty masterful how, if you really look at what youth are doing in digital spaces, it's really masterful how my students told me that she's basically clapping back. You know, she's pushing back against some of the harm, the trolling and the bullying that's happening. So it's interesting watching youth and how they engage in these spaces and what they value, and how they think these tools and spaces should be used. And yes, as an educator, as a researcher, as a parent, I cringe at times and I have fear about what could be said, and the impact of that. But we have strong ethical questions about what should we do at these times. So I'm going to keep moving on a little bit. Thank you for the questions so far. I really value it. I value the insight to figure out what is meaningful to all of you. So now I'm going to think about digital citizenship. There are a lot of different ways that this could go. There's a lot of ways to frame digital citizenship. One of the viewpoints is Mark Prensky's idea of digital natives. I don't really subscribe to this at all. I think that the mentality behind digital natives, a lot of the idea, Prensky has moved on from this, and a lot of the ideas have been debunked over time. But the general idea with digital natives is that the propensity or ability of an individual is based on their born on date. And so because our youth are born and they grow up in the soup of digital spaces, they're better able or better equipped to deal with these digital spaces. I don't entirely agree with that. I think under that, in that mentality, if I was born in the agricultural revolution, I'd be better off using a hoe or a rake than I am now. So I push back against this idea a little bit, to think that, where's my mouse? There's also Dave White's piece about visitors and residents. I really value this mindset, moving a little bit beyond the idea of digital natives. I really like Dave White's piece, thinking about our role in this. What I value about it is, with digital natives, there's this idea that many times I talk to adults, I talk to educators, and they think, well, I don't know as much about technology as my students. They know a lot more than I do, so I can't really teach them. Whereas digital, the visitors and residents has a lot more power embedded in it. And there's this idea of, I'm sort of like dipping in and dipping out of these spaces, trying to make sense of what the affordances of the space are, what the space and these tools allow me to do. And in the blog post, I share a really good video that talks by Dave White and his colleague, and a piece from First Monday that talks about visitors and residents and how to make sense of this. I also do a lot of, I am inspired by Gardner Campbell's idea of developing a personal infrastructure. And so the idea behind this is that we are identifying where we dip in and where we connect with digital spaces. We are deciding where we create our online identity and what we connect it with and what we back off from. So in my pre-service teacher classes, when I deal with professional development, I think about having a digital hub, and I'll talk about that at the end of the night, but having a digital hub, having a digital space where individuals can create their one canonical URL online, and then connecting out to other spaces online, connecting out to Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of the other spaces where we might exist, and developing those intersections and connections of where we live online. I'd also like to indicate the idea that digital literacy, being digitally literate, it's not a threshold. It's not a born on date. It's not a space where we get to a certain point and then we stop. It's a general condition. It's a general way of being. And it's something that we might always be striving for. And it's something that we might want to continually build upon. And I'd like to conclude this section by a quote from my good friend Doug Belshaw in his dissertation, and understand that this is all socially negotiated. In my work with Doug in the past in the Mozilla Web Literacy Initiative and a lot of my learning from him, I understand that there's a certain amount of ambiguity in all this. There's a certain amount of wiggle room. So what it means to be digitally literate will change over time, and it will constantly change. And it's our agreements as a community that nudge that and make, and we ultimately have the power to decide what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's ethical, what's not ethical. So I wanted to pause again and ask a question. Who bears responsibility in this? Who is or who should be accountable for what is ethical and what's not? Who should be accountable or responsible for development of these ethical practices? Thoughts?
Hi, I'm Charlotte. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that everyone is responsible. I think the companies that put forth these technologies are responsible in a way, but then the users are responsible and adults are responsible, but so are children. I think that we as the adults are responsible for sort of setting the tone, but then just as in our classrooms, our children are responsible for their behavior and ethics in class. It should be the same thing online. So everyone, but everyone has perhaps a different role in moderating or establishing sort of a code of ethics around their behavior.
Agreed. Thank you for that. Other thoughts?
So Kristen asked Dr. Turner, sorry, I'm just reading and my brain exploded. I'm so sorry. Dr. Turner asked a really interesting question in the chat, which is, do companies see themselves as responsible? And that kind of got me thinking about the fact that I don't think most companies actually take responsibility or like to see themselves as being the ones who need to take responsibility, but they like to show themselves as taking responsibility, which is part of the dual nature of being digital, is that they can post, oh yes, we're so sorry to hear about this, but they don't have to do any action. And it's becoming a way today where just saying you're sorry, but not doing anything about it for companies and on that side, for anybody, but in this case, companies, is really like a problem that we're coming across in creating ethical treatment on the internet, in the world of commerce and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's they have to monitor themselves, which I don't know that I believe they will, because they want to make money, right? And the best way to make money is to not hurt your brand. So you want to just apologize, but not change in a way that's going to cost you more. So
yeah, no, I agree with you. The on Netflix, there is the documentary, The Great Hack, looking at Cambridge Analytica and Facebook data, and who bears responsibility in that. Does Facebook owe it to us to show us what they're doing with their data? Does Facebook owe it to us to show us to safely and honestly and transparently handle our data? Do they not owe us anything? They're providing us this space. This is just the same way that we would engage in the park and engage online. They don't really owe us anything for that space.
I really like the question about the companies as well. And I keep thinking back to like food, because on food you have to have the ingredients, and there's laws about having all the ingredients on things, and there's been movements to try to get rid of that, so you don't know, but other people want to make sure the ingredients are there. I almost think it's like that. Like, we need to be able to see where our information is going. It's a law that we are able to see what we're taking into our bodies, for example. I feel like it should be very transparent. It should be some kind of law that we're able to see what's happening with our output, what's happening with our digital lives. I think that is kind of almost a human right in a sense. And I think that we need to move more towards making hard codifying what happens, because like Julia said, the companies, they're not going to do it. Some might, but mostly they want to make money. And even something as simple as like a drug company, like they'll say better than this with a little tiny asterisk at the bottom with all little ingredients that you can't really understand and nobody can understand, kind of analogous to your example about like it's inaccessible. We don't know. None of us know how to do the algorithms and all that stuff. That's not our fault, that's not our career. So that needs to be made so that everybody can understand it and access that.
Well, I mean, absolutely. The internet has become, it's no longer interpretable. And so if the internet is the dominant text of our generation and we use it for literacy practices, if we use it to read, write, communicate, socialize, connect with others, we need to be able to, we use it to educate ourselves, to inform ourselves. We need to be able to use this tool, this space to engage in those literacy practices. We no longer know if it's a fair playing field or not. And then we should have very severe questions in our K-12 classrooms, in higher ed, about the data trail that we leave behind. So as my daughter is in preschool, my teachers, her teachers in her classroom use ClassDojo and Seesaw to take photos of her and share it, and send notes about what she's doing. Google Classroom is always collecting data on our students. We know most of the digital tools and spaces we use are doing this. The learning management systems and the content management systems that we use in our schools, they're also collecting data. What happens when we move on? What happens when our students move on and they graduate 9th grade and move to 10th grade? What happens when we move from one institution to another or one district to another? Where does our data go? That's one of the questions that we never seem to try to answer or consider. Should we still have access to that? Should that be our content that we control over time? Or is that the property of the teacher? Dr. Turner and I just had some research where we asked our children some of this content, some of these questions. And I asked my son, what happens when you leave your elementary classroom? Where does your work go? And he believes, well, the teacher has it. The teacher, they maintain ownership of my content. They maintain my work. And I'm like, is that really true? And he's like, yes, my teacher should leave. Well, what if my teacher leaves the classroom and moves on? Should your teacher hold on to stuff? He's like, absolutely, she should. So it's interesting to think about what students think there. Thank you, Dr. Turner. All right. So
I don't know where you were. Is this where you were?
Yeah, we'll start there.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can't go to full screen presentation, or I can't manage other things. So we're going to see the whole thing. Okay.
I realized in the last that also my cursor froze, and then I was like, oh, I can't advance things. So I wanted to move forward a little bit. I am appreciative of the thoughts and questions, and we'll keep pushing in a little bit to see how you feel about this. So moving on to the next slide. We want to try and connect the dots and think about what it means to be a digital citizen, but then also what are the ethics as we engage in these communities. So go ahead. So one of the things that we'll think about is social practice theory. And basically what we're looking at is a spreadsheet of all the coursework that we have right now and all the visual pieces. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So we want to think about basically we engage online, we engage in these spaces, and all of the materials and the practices and the meanings, they all inform the way that I engage, the way that you engage. They inform the way we connect with one another's. Next slide, please. I'm also motivated by Dana Boyd's work with Network Publics and thinking about the communities that we engage in, the ways in which we connect with one another. One of the interesting things from my research is that I don't see this online offline dichotomy. I also do not see it. I see there also being hybrid or blended spaces. So even in my quote unquote normal classrooms that meet face to face for an hour a week. I build in online components, and I expect my students to learn and think and come back to me face to face, and we might flip the classroom a little bit. But there's a lot of connections. There's this these hybrid or blended opportunities through the use of digital tools where we can think a little bit and come back. And so Dana Boyd says in her piece in 2010 that we have the opportunity that these network publics, we provide individuals with the opportunity to transform the properties and potential and interactions and our needs of these collectives. So what we're talking about is, as we engage in these spaces, if we're all engaging on Facebook together or all engaging in Twitter together, there is the opportunity to take those tools, those spaces, those practices, and reinvent or re-examine the practices used there. So we can, for the most part, we have the power. We have the power to create and do whatever we want in those spaces. The next slide. And that raises the question about whether or not we had the necessary skills to do this, whether or not we had the agency to do this. This raises large questions about, as K-12 teachers, do we have the skill set when we enter our classroom to really utilize these tools? Do we have the latitude from our districts? Do we have the latitude from our building administrators? In higher ed, do we have the latitude and the permission to get out and engage and connect online? Do we have the skill set to know how to run a blog and share our ideas? Do we have the backing from our professional organizations? If I say something that's asinine online, which tends to happen, is NCTE or LRA or my peers, are they there to back me up and say, I give Ian the benefit of the doubt that he was trying to learn? Do we have the skill set to do this? But then also, do we have the agency? This is going back to the earlier question about whether or not the internet is interpretable. Do we understand fully what's happening in these spaces? Do we understand and know why some things go viral? Do we know why cat gifs go viral, but my long, deliberative pieces about critical literacy and critical digital literacy do not? Do we know why some podcasts go viral, but then the incredible Techno Panic podcast that Dr. Turner and I put out doesn't go viral? We don't fully understand why. We don't know the mechanisms behind the algorithms, behind the machine, the internet act the way that it acts. Next slide, please. So I have a general question about, is this what we really want? And I was leading into this question earlier when I was thinking about, I believe, and I've said this in an episode that Dr. Turner and I had of the Techno Panic podcast. I had a question about a general belief that for the most part, adults don't really know how to use these digital tools and spaces. I think that we're still trying to figure out how to use it. Many of us are trolling others or being trolled by others. Some of us are silenced by others. And we have concerns about screen time. And I'm trying to think about whether or not we really know how to use this. And I'm wondering, and I look at how we prepare K-12 teachers, how we prepare pre-service teachers, and we sort of prepare them with this mindset that we're going to prepare you for these literacy practices in our future. And I'm wondering, ethically, is that what we really want? Do we want to prepare youth for the type of internet or the discourse systems online that we currently engage in? I would suggest no. I would suggest that we want to have our youth push back. I'm recently really heartened by a lot of some of the things that we talked about before. I'm heartened by a lot of the digital practices and the way that youth are pushing back and engaging and restoring some of these narratives and trying to push their agenda and push their narrative and reuse these digital tools. So we see evidence of the use of digital tools that are a bit hidden and obfuscated. We see the rise of Snapchat by youth. We also see interesting anecdotal data where youth are creating fake and anonymous accounts. So I know that there's Finsta accounts, so youth will create fake Instagram accounts. But then I found the other day, and it might have been on our podcast, someone was talking to me about Dinsta or whatever, but basically like a double fake, or like a super private account for people. We see a lot of youth are engaging and using the VSCO forums. So I've learned recently what a VSCO girl is. And so we see a lot of youth that are using the VSCO forums, the photo editing space, and they're engaging in those little hidden parts of the internet to talk and express and be kids and hang out and mess around and geek out. So I've been wondering a lot lately about whether or not this is what we really want. Next slide, please. I'd also like to indicate that I believe, I'm a literacy educator and researcher. I believe that literacy is all about power. I think that we have the same sort of power differential throughout time. When we see Martin Luther in the 95 Theses, we see power differentials when we express and engage with others and share a point of view. And so really what we're talking about is not just ethics, but we're thinking about power and control and dissemination, or holding back of power from others. So another question for you. So how do we promote desired ethics? How do we think about making sure that we identify and promote ethics that are inclusive for all? How do we try and share this out with others so that we can make sure that all have a voice?
I think that in a way, it's like about using, to use a teacher term, to use modeling, but like use modeling as a human being, which I think we actually do all the time. Um, like parents do it all the time for their kids and stuff like that. And when you're with a group, like let's say in a group of people and there's some younger kids in it, you tend to like model the behavior you wish to see. So if you're trying to do the kind of like treatment of others that we talked about and the communication skills we talked about, the best way to promote it is by doing it yourself, not just to model, but to also prove the, if I'm telling you to do it, I should be doing it too theory. Because I think people put a lot of stock into that. And if you just tell someone to do it and then don't practice what you preach, like, I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it. So it's really about like demonstrating it and following it because it's what you believe is right, not just saying you should do it and then doing it when you feel like it's best.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. What is your advice when we engage with colleagues, or we have students, we have adults that they don't want to get involved in digital spaces? They just don't like the tenor and tone of conversation there. They don't want to have that trail of data that's being hoovered up by them.
Well, for one thing, I definitely would try to encourage them to, if you don't like the way that communication is on here, then why don't you voice that and we can communicate in a way that is easier for you. It is about being willing to make accommodations. The accommodation that person is making is, I'm going to try this format that I'm not comfortable with. The accommodation that you then make in return is, and we can do that in a way in which you are comfortable. So what do we need to do to make your communication easier? I do think the thing about having a trail online is hard, because like even for me, everybody kind of knows this who's been in the classes with me before, is I don't really like posting stuff online very much. My parents raised me in such a way where they were like, nope, you don't want other people to know your stuff. It's your business. Don't post stuff. They were just very much that way. So for me, I'm not quite sure how I would handle that advice-wise.
It's a tough call. I mean, it's one of those, in my classes, I urge my students to have a digital identity. I push for open. Dr. Turner will share you, will indicate that I share probably a bit too much, but I push for open with my students. I urge my colleagues to regularly blog and share a digital identity. There are a lot of my colleagues that don't like the fact that I do that, but I push for open, and I dream of a world where we all can share our narrative and share our identity and be proud of who we are online and not get trolled. But with that, I recognize the privilege in me saying that. I recognize that I am a white male in a racist system. I recognize the fact that not everyone believes that they should share their stuff online. And so ultimately, I allow my students to decide how much they want to share and if they want to share at all. And I think that it is an individual decision. They should have the latitude to do that. I dream of a place where we all could just share.
I think an alternative to, sharing personal information is to elevate others online in an inclusive way. So I see this a lot in online communities around sewing. I like to sew. And there's a lot of talk of, okay, so do pattern companies make patterns for extended size ranges? Or, hey, here's someone who sews because they live in a wheelchair and normal clothes don't work for them. And there's a lot of elevating diverse perspectives within the community. And I think it's, even just in your research of digital spaces, it could be an interesting place to visit because it is so inclusive. And you don't necessarily have to share about yourself, but you can share someone else's story, or you can, push things forward that are really positive and inclusive.
So sewing is so inclusive. We'll talk after the show. So I agree with you. I think there's opportunities to elevate, to amplify, to advocate for others. To try and share the voices of others and sort of hand over the mic and take a step back. I thank you all for these thoughts. Dr. Turner, let's continue on a little bit, and then we can have time for questions at the end. So now I generally have a couple points here on next steps and where this might lead us. A lot of this is exactly what we were talking about before, what our practices should be, where we should begin this. I do a lot of work thinking about K-12 students and digital practices and being digitally literate, but also really pushing the boundaries of what it means to be digitally literate. Really take use and amplify the voices of others, but also push our narrative and opportunities to re-story for our groups. But I think that we need to start with K-12 teachers. Lately, I've been trying to make my research more accessible, more approachable. That includes the podcast and the blogging and everything else. But are there ways that we can try and build up the skill set of K-12 teachers and fight for K-12 teachers so that they can try and engage in these practices and not feel like they're bombarded if they step out and try to voice their opinion online? So one of the first things I say in the next slide is build a digital identity. Have your digital identity online. I have a number of blog posts where I talk about building up your one canonical URL, your one space, creating that one spot online so that you can have an identity, you can voice your narrative. And once again, this is us being a little bit more thoughtful about pushing the agenda and pushing the boundaries of what it means to engage ethically as an educator online, what it means ethically to be a learner online, and setting new parameters and showing new students and new teachers what opportunities there are out there to be a digital citizen, a web literate citizen, but also engage ethically online. I think that we need to be digitally literate, we have to be literate in digital spaces. Next slide. This slide has been coming up multiple times over this week as my institution is moving to distance learning and online learning. This has been popping up as I see other K-12 and higher ed institutions very quickly exploring and playing with online learning. One of the things, and this is something I've been saying for about a decade now, is we need to start preparing our teachers to fully digitize our workflow. So that means being digital first as we create content online, and then build those hybrid learning opportunities. So we start with what's my digital hub and my space, but then really leaning in and pushing those opportunities and showcasing how can I teach online, be ethical in my practice, do my best job, and learn as I proceed. Next slide, please. I think that there is the need for us to build that hub and share with others. I know that in other versions of this virtual series that you have, a lot of my colleagues have talked about personal and professional learning networks, PLNs, and sharing content online. You are all on the foregrounds of these spaces. You're actively trying to problematize and think about these contexts. There is a need for all of you to have your one spot online and actively reflect and share and learn from one another, and we're all trying to solve the same problems. So there are opportunities for us to learn from one another. But what that means is creating those digital identities and sharing those resources and connecting online. Next slide, please. This is very nice. So one of the other things is testing out, revising, iterating over time, bringing in that engineering mindset. Nothing that we do has to be completely perfect the first time that we send it out. Barack Obama once said that good is still better. And so if we have an initial unit plan or a lesson plan, or we're trying to figure out what digital ethics means, the blog post that I put out today, I'm sure there's numerous errors in that. The edited text that Dr. Turner put out is incredible. It is way better than the one small piece that I put in there. But even after that piece, that text was all put together, a number of us met at NCTE and had a session, and we talked about the need for a new text and new things that we're learning and thinking as we develop and put our ideas out there. So there's a need to put our flag in the ground and identify where we currently are and move on and continue to reflect, revise, share new ideas, and continue moving further down the path. Next slide, please. So I wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit with all of you and thinking about, do you believe that you're ethical digital citizens? Are there things that you're currently doing now in your practice, either your personal lives, professional lives, that shows that you are trying to make this happen?
So I think I'd like to share an example of how I think I need to do better at this. I feel like in my professional life, I am very committed to it, and in thinking about how we teach and learn and create ethical communities and create, as you said, Ian, like a generation who's going to do better than what we are currently doing, and who's going to be a generation of advocates and make change about the practices that have been kind of falling into place because adults don't really know how to use these spaces. But I find myself in my personal life being very much what we would probably call a bystander, not wanting to put myself out there in my personal digital communities as a person who calls people out, who kind of shuts down negative discourse. And instead I'll complain about it to my husband or my kids or my parents or whoever happens to be around, but I'm not actually trying to make a difference in that space. So I feel like I need to do better about that, but it's going to take changing who I am in those spaces. And I haven't been quite ready to do that.
I'll jump in and suggest that I am trying to do the same. I try to advocate for others. I try to call out behaviors that I don't entirely agree with. I have been doing a lot of soul searching over the last 2-3 years, thinking about my identity, my role, my privilege, and what voice, if any, I should have. And so that's been a struggle of mine as well. You know, the best help for me in all of this was Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility, and that has helped me think about I have a role to play in all of this. I can either be complicit or I can confront a lot of these negative discourses and push for better ethical practice. But that's still, it's hard for me to do. Other voices, do you believe that you're an ethical digital citizen?
I think I try to be. I think that, like, I mean, the thing that I'm probably working on is getting more involved and incorporating more kind of like digital work into what I do. Because it is very easy with theater to kind of be like, okay, cool. Well, theater is about your authentic, honest truth and like not having, you know, like a barrier between you and your performance or whatever. And so it's easy for me to kind of be like, oh yeah, so I don't really need to do this online thing. Like I'll just show some videos and like this and the other. And I mean, I love my CT, but she's not also not like the most, you know, digitally savvy lady that I know, which I love her. She's great. But you know, she's been teaching for 30 years at this school and she's like, yeah, you know, I post on Google Classroom sometimes. I'm trying to like encourage her and myself to both start using more platforms where we get the students to be involved in the arts digitally, because I think being an ethical, I like to say that theater is an education in empathy, and empathy leads to being more, I think, of an ethical person. And so being able to incorporate that more in the digital realm would be very helpful to that. So I'm just trying to like be more aware and more involved and get more engaged.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Any last points? So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you about this. I think that these are pretty tough questions. I wish that I could give you more concrete answers about what all of this means. I think the question about what it means to be ethical or what ethics means is a bit ambiguous. There's a lot of ambiguity in that. There's a lot of wiggle room. And I think there's the need for educators, researchers, parents, and students to push against that and fight for the type of ethics that we want, the type of ethics that we think the future should hold. We also are fighting an uphill battle, and we have to think about the real power holders in these equations and whether or not we know what they're doing. So feel free to stay in touch. Dr. Turner will share this slide deck. I know it's already in the show notes. There also is a blog post that goes along with this. I would suggest I have a weekly newsletter that I try to unpack all of these components that you can subscribe to or pay attention to. So it's meant to be a easy read for most of the people that would be on this webinar, just a once a week what's happening. And by all means, check out our work with the Screen Time Research Group and listen to the Technopanic podcast. And you can listen to the dulcet tones of Dr. Kristen Turner. And so with that, I will hand it back over to my partner in crime.
Thank you so much for being here. I think as everyone can see, Ian is not only a member of, but the creator of multiple digital communities, which is why I asked him to do the meditation on the ethics of digital communities and to share his expertise with you. So Ian, thank you so much for being here. To the rest of you, we have one more webinar in our series. It's going to happen in a couple of weeks. And for everybody who doesn't know, Drew University just announced it's moving to online instruction. We're closed for the rest of this week, unless you already had online learning opportunities like this one. And we will be moving to online instruction, hopefully returning to normal instruction just in time for our final webinar series, which will be in April. But thank you again, and I will see everybody soon.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you.